So thank you, Dr. Ike. Hi, everyone. I am really glad to be here with you today to talk to you a little about some of the issues I've been at least thinking about. So I will say up front that what I am presenting is more of a conceptual um, kind of way to think about issues of bias and hiring and underrepresented groups. So it's not an empirical, I'm not bringing empirical data into this talk. So just kind of setting expectations. And what I hope is that you will feel comfortable, asking questions and joining in the conversation. I don't see this as a lecture or me talking at you for the hour. I'd like to have some more interaction, so please feel free. So I'm going to share my screen, so just give me a sec to get up and running. All right. So I wanted to talk about this idea of reproduction of inequality when we think about AI platforms. And in particular, I look at hiring because my research historically has looked at groups that are marginalized in the tech sector. So I spend a lot of time with women, Black and African Americans, Latin, Latino populations, and thinking about what are some of the barriers that make it so difficult for them not only to enter tech fields, but to persist. And so my prior research is looking at students who are undergrads who are in tech, primarily at historically Black colleges and universities, but also predominantly white institutions, and trying to see how they think about IT and IT careers and what are their pathways, their career pathways. How do they make their way through? And one of the issues I found, especially for students who are studying at historically Black colleges and universities and Hispanic serving institutions, is they go through, complete their undergrad coursework, graduate, and then that transition from college to work becomes really hard. Recruiters don't necessarily go there looking for students, and perceptions about the quality of the education that they received. And so there's some significant barriers. But now it seems like we have these AI hiring platforms, that's something new being brought into the mix. And I'm thinking about what are the implications for these underrepresented, aspiring IT people, where before they had these human evaluators and human systems that were barring them from entry and making it more difficult. Now that we have these algorithms that are to a large extent part of the process, what does that mean? And in particular, what does that mean in terms of diversifying the IT field? So that's kind of the backstory to where we're going. So, my motivation is a lot of times when we think about bias in AI, it's from this perspective of a technical problem. So can we have data sets that aren't representative of the general population. So what can we do to take that data set and make it more representative? Or sometimes we do after the fact, scientists, researchers, and software developers, will go in and check for bias after the system is deployed. And if you remember the big fiasco that took place at Amazon when they were using AI platforms to look at applicants, and women were systematically being excluded because the algorithm was trained on data of successful employees, and those employees were overwhelmingly male. And so the algorithm kind of learned that bias and perpetuated it. So a lot of thinking is in that space, looking at bias from a technical perspective. But there's another side, which is the human side. And that's where I primarily live, thinking about diversity problems that impede people's ability to participate in IT. And this has been a long-standing problem. Back when in the 60s, when tech was really working its way into organizations, women were present. If you saw the movie Hidden Figures, you have an example there. If you think about Grace Hopper and women in IT, you know, Admiral in the Navy created the COBOL programming language. So a lot of women were working in technology. And then over time, the technology space began to be, you know, more men finding their way in, and then women effectively being kind of pushed out, marginalized and on the side. And then, you know, in the 80s, as people were graduating, there was an uptick where we saw more women and people of color coming into IT, but then that slowly declined. And we've been on this decline for quite a while. And things are, you know, kind of leveling off, but still we have women, Black and Latinx professionals who are just woefully underrepresented in the tech field. And so to my thinking, you can't change problems if you don't have a seat at the table. So to the extent to which certain voices are not present at the table as we're designing and implementing and rolling out these technologies, doing research about these technologies, if certain populations are excluded, then their perspectives are absent. And what it turns out to be is that the people who are most likely to be excluded are the people who bear the brunt of bad technologies, technologies that impose on their freedom of movement. If we think of surveillance technologies, technologies that are making assumptions about them and categorizing them as, you know, criminals. We have medical systems where people who are African American are systemically being excluded from certain treatments because the algorithms don't give them the adequate priority. And so lots of examples of how these biases are affecting marginalized groups. And so if we're trying to build this technology, then we need workplace cultures that are inclusive. So it's not just having a seat at the table, you have to be able to be invited to that conversation and help drive the decisions that are being made at that table. And that's really where inclusive cultures are. And we know tech has not a good reputation for being inclusive. If we think about the Me Too movement, we have people at Amazon who are trying to organize and form labor unions. We have a lot of examples of women who are leaving the workforce. In fact, women are, I believe it's 39% more likely to leave the workforce, IT workforce, than men. We know women don't advance as quickly, lots of issues there. So we bring diverse people in, give them a seat at the table where they have some voice, where they feel valued and recognized. And an outgrowth of that is when we make our design decisions and we have this perspective of being equitable, of creating systems that where we minimize the bias, but we're also talking about, from this lens of equity, how you can not further perpetuate or reproduce these power dynamics. So how can you create technology that won't further disadvantage poor communities or LGBTQ plus communities and other groups who have been stigmatized and marginalized historically? So that's the big picture of what I've been thinking about and what I'm trying to tease out in my current work. So with that said, we will move on to talk a little bit about identity. So I wanted to ask you all, and feel free to unmute and pop in, or you can chat. If we think about identity as this soup, right, this bowl of soup, and we have all these different ingredients, and your identity or who you are as a person can be represented by the various ingredients. So, how do you think about yourself with respect to a workplace or a career identity? What's important to you? Okay. So people are talking about their upbringing, the ability to have open and honest and transparent communication. People talking about their drive. We have active listening. So these are all, I shouldn't say all, but some are properties of our, our work ethic, our professionalism. But what about you, like digging deeper into your identity? So these are kind of like characteristics and preferences and so forth, but who are you? So I'm pushing you to think a little deeper. If we think about these power dynamics and how they play out, what might be some of those dimensions? Okay, so we're having so this idea of different roles, right? Researchers, students, women, men. So those are important aspects. Female mentors, which is interesting. So when we think about our identities, it's all these all-encompassing issues. So we have someone who talked about, female being their age group, an identity as an artist, their race, ethnicity, and their role as a parent and a wife. There's a lot going on here. Physical identity, and how students, so if you're an instructor-student relationship, how those play off one another. So who you are, your identity manifests itself in those relationships. People are talking about hobbies they do, things they like to eat. I know this bowl of food looks yummy. Age. Yeah, age is interesting, especially, I'm looking and we have a lot of professors who are early in their career, and being young presents some challenges. And even as students, as you graduate and go into your workforce, age is going to be a interesting identity characteristic that will shape some of your experiences too. Kayla put in an interesting concept that we'll come back to later, but this idea of intersection. So we have all these identities. Our soup isn't just broth, right? It's rich with colors and flavors, and that richness, and looking at how that makes the soup better, both visually and the textures and the tastes. That's what diversity is about. And so if we put this in the context of work, we can see that there are a lot of identities that might be at play, right? We have our age, we have belief systems, and that's some of what people talked about, mental health and health status, given the population that we're talking about with you all, work styles. So a lot of characteristics go into this concept of diversity. It's bigger and richer than just who we are in terms of our race, gender, um, sexual orientation, gender identity. Those are core, and we talk about those a lot, but it's so much richer. So thinking about these identities, another question for you: who makes technology? So let's see if what your answers are for that one. Okay. So humans. Do animals make technology? Uh, are animals capable of making technologies? So for example, is a monkey who takes a stick and licks it and sticks it into the ant hole to lure out some of the ants and pulls it out and eats them off the stick? Is that a technology? Is that a technology creator? A lot of interesting questions there, right? And I think foundational is what is technology, but that's a whole nother subject. Um, but who makes technology is important for thinking about these questions of bias, discrimination, equity, inclusion, diversity. Um, and so if we look at some of the answers that are rolling in, right, we said depends on how you define technology is huge. And we have end users, so it doesn't have to be a professional, right? It could be everyday people like us, and people with resources, and that's huge. You have to have the time and talent. To some extent, you have to have the money to be able to create technology. So there's lots of people who are engaged in this activity. Those of you who talked about corporations and more of this professional class of people who create software, that's who we're going to talk about today. But it's important to recognize that they're not the be all end all people who create important technologies for our world, right? We see even with all of the storming of the Capitol, for instance, we have an information scientist who is archiving a lot of the content that was being presented on some of the platforms by the people who were there protesting and just running amok in the Capitol. And so, everyday person taking their time and talents and resources to create with technology. So if we think about the IT workforce, and I limited us to, for this discussion, to talk about race and in particular, Black workers in tech. And if we look at this group, we can see that from 2014 to 2019, which is kind of the latest dates that we have for these tech companies who reveal their diversity numbers as they report to EEO. these companies are reporting some rather low numbers of African Americans who are on their workforce. And so you can see, Apple is, running, none of them are exceeding 8%. And it's important to think about Amazon because when they report, they look at their entire workforce. So they aren't just reporting people who are in tech. And these are also self-reported numbers. So there's, you have to look at the numbers with some, through a critical lens. But the big takeaway is that what we're seeing is over this short period of time, and this is a period of time when all these companies were making these commitments to diversity, that really very little has changed. And in particular, if you think about hiring, we have these systems set up, we hire people, don't do a really good job of making the workplace inclusive. And kind of, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. It could be, lack of mentors might be why people leave. Some people are, when they're hired at a level that's lower than what their credentials suggest they should be at. You see that a lot of tech companies that hire women in particular at lower ranks than what their credentials and professional experience would suggest. So that's under leveling. We also see people who leave because their pay gaps. So a lot of reasons why people leave, but fundamentally it's an issue of inclusion. So if I'm in your organization and I'm not treated in a manner where I'm respected and valued, I'm going to vote with my feet. And so that's what's so important about not just diversity, but also that inclusion piece. And so, we can look at some of these statements that are being made by the CEOs at some of these companies. And we can see here at Google, the CEO is claiming that in 4 years, 5 years, they have a goal of 30% of leaders being from underrepresented groups. But right now, if you look at the US, 96% of the leaders are white and Asian, and almost 3/4 are men, and that's globally. So a lot of work to do here, a lot of promise, not sure about the accountability. We also have Microsoft, so they made a commitment, and these are commitments that came out right after the George Floyd murder, and these are companies kind of responding to that, and so it's part of that moment in time. And so the CEO is saying they're going to add $150 million to their diversity and inclusion initiatives. And as part of that, they're going to double the number of Black and African American people in various levels of the organization. And then we can look at Facebook. And Mark Zuckerberg, he's also making some commitments. He's talking about a workforce where half of the people employed will be from underrepresented communities, and doubling Black and Latino employees. Right now, Black and Latino employees are at 3.8 and 5.2% respectively. So there's a lot of ideas out there, a lot of goals being set, but looking at the trends, I don't know. I'm not feeling very confident, but this is a place where I would love to be wrong. We have a point being made in the chat about, it's looking at people going into the workforce and some of these barriers, and in particular, the salary gap. It's like, how do these percentages get these companies? Okay, so they're looking at I'm trying to process the question as I'm reading it. And then he's talking about the general population. So in the general population, African Americans are about 12, 13%. So, underrepresented in that respect. And for a lot of organizations, when they're talking about diversity, they want to have the diversity of their organization sync up with the general population diversity in the US. Or if they're operating in other countries, the local demographics. So that's usually the goal that people are trying to shoot for. And when we say underrepresented, from a scholarly perspective, that's where we're coming from. Okay. So let's think about inclusion and push a little further. So if you think about organizations where you've worked, or even making some assumptions about the IT workplace, who's typically valued and supported in that workplace? So your thoughts are appreciated. So we have people in senior roles. So these are people who have figured out how to navigate the organization and be successful for the most part. So these are people who would feel very much included. People who speak up, which is interesting, right? Because sometimes speaking up is very much approved, but sometimes speaking up gets you into trouble. And with respect to diversity, what research would suggest, a lot of times if women or people of color talk about discrimination or negative experiences that they're having in the company, or the culture not working for them, they're often penalized. But if people from majority groups raise those same issues, it's taken positively, which feels so backwards, but that's a consistent research finding. Experience, yes, people with tech experience will prosper. People who are advocates, and that's very helpful because they help people navigate the organization, and they are like cheerleaders for that person. They push for their success. And people already established in groups in tech. So in tech, we typically talk about men, and I think you have to look at the intersections of that statement I was just about to make, because we talk about men as being overrepresented in tech, but I think you have to parse that out, right? We just said Latinx and African American and Black males are underrepresented. And then when we look at Asian males, heavily populated in the tech roles, but not well represented in the management roles. And so there's some stereotyping that goes on with Asian men in terms of leadership and American notions, I would say, of leadership and hyper masculinity and so forth. So, looking at these intersections become important. If we think about inclusion in the workplace, it's really about this climate where everybody can benefit from the ideas that are being expressed, and everybody's knowledge is being brought into the decision making. But oftentimes, inclusion is hard to achieve. And if you go one step further, people talk a lot about belonging. And so if inclusion is being able to come to to work and be your best self, like you can really contribute and you're valued and supported. Belonging is you bring your full self. So warts and all, but you can bring your full self there and still feel like you're supported. You don't have to feel like you're hiding aspects of your identity. You can just be your authentic self. And that's really quite rare in the workplace. So that's something more of an aspirational place to be. And I think until organizations are able to have these tough conversations about inclusion and diversity and how they are represented and reproduced in the technologies that are being created, it's going to be tough to ever get to that belonging stage. But we should shoot for inclusion. Okay. So thinking about inclusion and being able to have a voice and do your work and being really good at it, Timnit Gebru brings in a very interesting story because it's kind of a counter narrative to what we would, not what I would expect as a Black woman, but for many people seems counterintuitive. So here we have this really star in AI, and she's doing work around big data sets and bias. And this is work that might negatively impact Google's bottom line. But she's hired to be an AI ethicist, right? She's hired to be critical about technology and try to come up with some solutions to address those biases. And for that, she's unceremoniously dismissed. She wrote a paper about her research. Her in the chain of command, her supervisor did not approve of the research that she did. And there's this rule out there about getting permission and having your research screened before it's submitted to conferences and so forth. But this is a rule on paper, policy on paper, that is not well enforced. So part of this inclusion issue is, you have these established policies, but they're not applied to everybody equally. So that's one way where workforces fall short of inclusion. And if you're following this story, you know that thousands of people have advocated in Timnit's defense to really dig in and push this issue of equity and inclusion in technology. And this quote from a representative in Congress really, for me, rings so true. And she talked about ethical AI as a battleground, especially for populations who've historically been marginalized. It's like we need our academic freedom. We need to write our authentic selves in the work environment, in the types of research we want to engage in. And it's just really important to advance the field and to make technologies that are finding more and more ways of determining what our life chances are. Will we get a mortgage? Will we get the medical treatment that we need? Will we be treated fairly in a courtroom? All these decisions, so many of these decisions are now being impacted by algorithms. So it kind of raises the stakes. So moving from inclusion, that brings us to equity. And equity is about justice, right? It's about being impartial, it's fairness. And it's different from diversity and inclusion, where they're kind of more of states, characteristics. But when we get into equity, we're in this space of processes. And that's important. So it's these systems. And we've been hearing a lot about systemic racism and systemic, other issues with respect to diversity. And those fall under this area of equity. So how can I create processes in organizational settings that will systematically make changes that benefit people? And we know, at least in the context of education and universities, when you create policies and procedures that are equitable, then they tend to benefit everybody. So it's not like a special privilege that you're given to various groups. It's groups that have been disadvantaged by the status quo. Then what can we do to better their experience? And as a byproduct of that, it typically benefits people outside of that scope. So if we go on to equity in tech, this was an interesting quote from someone who was in an interview, and they were talking about African-American communities and technology. And they said, my community doesn't trust companies that are majority white and male. We don't see people like us succeeding in those companies. So why would we even take the time to apply for those jobs? And there's a lot going on in this quote, because we know as educated people that there are pathways to tech careers that don't require a college degree. But if you think about it, you can do the boot camps and so forth. That might be more in reach for someone who is, living in a lower income community and doesn't have the resources and the luxury of time and childcare responsibilities that might make a college education unrealistic. So you have that going on, but you also have these perceptions, and perceptions are a reality for people. And so it's, if you think about diversifying the field and creating an environment that's inclusive and changing policies to help make that happen, but the people you're trying to assist and bring into the organization don't feel like they can trust you, it's a real tension there. And so that brings us to the question of if we're trying to design, and this is the big context, right? We have people in the organization who are largely absent from the systems that we're creating. But we're creating these technologies that really provide access to the jobs that create the technologies. It's like this, this double loop here. And so if we are creating technologies, thinking about equity, how might that play out? And these are some ideas, some things that I've encountered in my research and in projects that I'm on, a project I'm on with the World Economic Forum, where we're creating a toolkit for AI for HR. And in these spaces, these are the types of issues we talk about. We talk about the social contexts, issues of power, the logics that govern the sourcing of the data, the governance of the data, and the algorithms themselves. So we'll talk about a few of these issues. We have to think about the intersection of multiple identities, and we talked about this a little bit before. So if we have algorithms that are arbiters of identity, right? They're trying to detect identity. So if you think about the work that's being done, or that was done by Timnit and Joy Buolamwini, their work was looking at how facial recognition genders different people and how it was misgendering women, but in particular women with dark skin. So you can imagine some of the implications. And it's interesting because when I was picking this picture on Unsplash to add, the annotation for it was that it was a picture of a Black man in a gray sweater. I'm like, wow. And so, whose identity is represented is going to be important. We want to have inclusive data sets. And we also have to think about this idea that some companies like Blendor want to strip identity characteristics and just let resumes stand on their technical merit. But the issue with that, as I've given it further thought, it really absolves the organization of addressing issues of race or veteran status or gender or any of the other demographic markers that make advancement into technology more difficult. So those are some things to think about. We have to think about social context, because data and people exist and are created and reproduced in these contexts. So thinking about population differences. So if you are African American trying to apply for a tech job, but the company's hiring system is built on data of successful employees who do not look like you, they're not going to reflect your reality, your lived experiences, then there's a probability or possibility for the algorithm to systemically not include you. So, these being different could have implications for you. And some of these problems that are being generated might not be fixed readily by technical solutions. So that's something to think about. We also have this idea of the political, and algorithms really don't deal with the political. So there's questions that we need to ask. Is it that we made mistakes in the design and development, so it's a bad execution of a design idea? Or is the idea just bad to begin with? And the one that comes to mind for me is this AI that was looking at pictures and then determining whether or not someone was gay. It's like, why would you even think about creating a technology like that? It just made no sense. So sometimes it's just an idea that's just rotten. When we're thinking about trying to overcome, discrimination, bias, these negative outcomes, do we just talk about this sense of bias, which, as we said, is typically a technical kind of consideration? Or do we go a step further and dig into our morals and our sense of justice and bring in and really stress the equity aspects? Like, we want to change the existing environment. We want a new way of doing things, new categories to determine who advances and who does not. And if you look at companies like Parametrics, their CEO, Frida, I had a good conversation with her, and she was talking about how they use cognitive characteristics. And there's all these established psychological tests out there, which that has its issues. But the design inspiration is that you can look for people's potential. So if I know some of your skills and talents, and psychologically I have some insights into your likes and dislikes and preferences, I can actually tell you what jobs in the organization you might be well suited for. And so it's about revealing that potential in people. So it's an interesting idea that could have some positive implications for equity and justice. And lastly, we have to think about these cyber-human systems, and technology has agency, and so does the human being. And at what level do you want to harness that technology agency? Is it just going to help you with some of the decision-making? Is it going to give you insights about your existing workforce that might be useful for tailoring interview questions and other evaluation mechanisms? Or do you really go off the deep end and just let the AI do the work for you? And that is clearly not recommended, but it's happening out there. And so to wrap this all up and to lead us into our discussion, there's a really powerful quote here, and it's from an article in the MIT Technology Review that came out a few weeks ago, but it's about AI, and AI can't work unless it works for everybody. And the basic argument that's being made is that we, the makers of these technology systems, that we make a lot of design choices. And then she gives a number of examples, languages, data sets, what sites to crawl, what algorithms to use, what techniques we'll use for optimization. And we even choose who becomes part of our tribe, right? Who can be an engineer, a data scientist, a programmer, a manager. And we control who is part of that workforce and who is not. And there are so many possibilities for the technology, and we choose to reproduce these systems that historically have not worked for certain people. And this is us. And so it's our responsibility to make those improvements and to be very thoughtful and think about issues of equity when we're designing software. And so with that said, I will wrap up and I will turn it back over to Liz. If there are any questions, I'm happy to talk about them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yarger. I wish we were all in person, but if we could just give Dr. Yarger a huge round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, I appreciate it.
So I would love to open it up for questions. I have some questions, but I want to open it up to the rest of the group. So if you have a question, either pop it in the chat, you can raise your hand, you can unmute, and Edward and I will monitor the chat and also the hand raising feature. We got lots of thank yous in the chat.
Yeah. And if I missed the point that you were making earlier and you want to reiterate that or expand on that, please feel free as well.
As people are sort of thinking about, oh, maybe we do have a question. Oh, no, okay. As people are thinking about their questions, oh, okay, we have one from Benjamin already. Do you believe that a perfect AI, which is capable of being free of discrimination, can exist? Or is this an idealist concept that is impossible to implement?
I'm just thinking, wow, that's like a sci-fi movie where we create the perfect technology and then we find out that it's not quite what we expected. I don't think so. If we as human beings, if you even take technology out of the equation, and we as human beings can't create societies where everyone has a equal opportunity to be successful and to live up to their potential, I don't think we can, as human beings, can then create a technology. And my mind is going to the Matrix sci-fi movie where the technology tried to create a perfect world for people and we resisted it. So I don't think that that's possible, no. I don't know if anyone else has a contrary opinion. Someone is making a comment, okay. So AI researcher mentioned earlier for creating AI model to predict sexual preferences from facial data. They actually recently published a model for identifying potential political preferences from faces. Okay. Wow. So thank you. I'll have to check that out, TechCrunch. Jeez.
We have another question. This might be a pretty high level question, but how do we know when we've included enough perspectives when we think of we in technology? Members within specific demographic groups may also have different needs depending on the complexity of overlap and experiential factors. So how do we know when we've done enough to publicize our tools and the technologies we are developing?
Really, really thoughtful question. Because it takes us back to the identity soup, right? Because we're all complex, and at some level we're all unique, right? So it would be really difficult to cover everything. But I think we have to be quite mindful of the technology that we're creating is right, always going to be part of this bigger context. So if I'm doing healthcare, for example, and I know that there are biases that exist in NIH funding, I know there are biases that exist for people of color, and especially in pregnancy and having problems, and some women dying. So we know that there's these health disparities. So we realize those, and I think as technologists, we need to collaborate with people who understand that domain and really understand some of these disparities that exist and tap into that insight. We can't resolve every issue, but I think ignorance is not an excuse. I think it's our responsibility, if we're creating these technologies that are going to be so massive and so important to diverse people in our society, we owe it to them to do our due diligence. And I think that's really what I would say. We do our due diligence.
I also have another question. So thank you. This was incredibly insightful, but I wonder what role tech and or specifically AI has in equity and justice organizing. I think about how community organizing might have been made easier through tech tools, but has it been proven to be more detrimental than useful? Would love your thoughts.
Okay, so organizing, I'm assuming it's in the context of political organizing. And I know, at least in the Black Lives Matters movement, there was a lot of tech being used to this in Arab Springs and a lot of these civil protests where people are sharing ideas, information, ways to circumvent the police, in the sense that you know where the police will be and where there are problems jumping off. Maybe they're shooting rubber bullets, and to avoid that space. There's also citizen journalism, where people are taking videos and documenting what's occurring and having their stories told through their lens, not mediated by the media or other positions of power. So in that sense, I think the technology has a power to democratize power. I find that to be very liberating and very helpful. I mean, people are crowdsourcing, funding for people whose medical bills might need to be paid, or people who need to be bailed out of jail who were caught up in the protests. So you have that side. But you also have these same tools and techniques being used by groups who are more destructive. And so that human intent, that intentionality, I think that's the distinguishing factor of whether or not these tools that are being created and how they're being deployed and the impacts that they're making for people. A lot of it's shaped by our intentions. So there.
Yeah, somebody's saying ignorance is not an excuse times 1,000. It looks like there's another question. Do you think there are similar challenges in academic institutions researching technology? Does being able to choose the research group or mentor you work with allow for a person of color to choose workplaces where he or she will thrive?
That's a deeply that question is hitting me deep because that's the story of my life. I think, you know, when you're looking at your work environment research, there's a big difference if you're on depending on how secure your employment is in that place. So if you're a new assistant professor, you have a lot more power and influence than a person who's on the teaching track, who's employed for a contract. So we have also tenured professors who are your associate and full professors, more than likely. And there they have the protection of tenure. And tenure is supposed to, right, embolden you to do creative work, to kind of push into these areas that aren't easy for society to want to deal with. But oftentimes tenure turns into this, let's just preserve the status quo because it works for me. So yeah, there's some freedom in being allowed to choose your research and pick who you collaborate with. But again, there's these bigger systems. You know, if you think about funding, what's in vogue right now? You know, cybersecurity. Just look at how all the research switched to COVID. And that's not a criticism, but it's just a reality that if you work in another area, the funds available to you are going to dry up because we have something more pressing going on. There's still that bigger environment that's going to impose on your intellectual freedom. And I think that's a reality that would have to live with and be cognizant of.
So I realize we're at 5. I want to respect everybody's time. We have a couple more questions in the chat, and I think they are good questions, but I also would just want to respect all of your time. So at this point, I think we can wrap it up. I'm happy to stay on a little bit after, particularly for those of you who are just interested in chatting. I know we have students on here that I haven't had the opportunity to meet. So I'll hang around for a little bit. But Dr. Yarger, I'd like to give you an out also because you are on the East Coast. So she is wrapping up her evening with us over on the East Coast. And I know we have some other East Coasters. So just again, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Yarger.
Thank you. Thank you. Like I said, it's good to be here. And it's nice to have a space to talk about some of these issues that are not easy to talk about, but to think of them in a scholarly way and have those kind of deliberations, I think is healthy for democracy. So thank you for inviting me. I wish you all the best in your studies. Please stay safe and healthy. And I hope to see good things emerge for all of you. So take care.
Thank you, you too.